Today I'm going to make a cocoa cake. I'll put the list of ingredients and utensils you'll need on my video. You can pause the video, write them down, and then we'll get started. We'll start by leaving our butter out to soften. Next we'll measure out our flour. Then we'll add our baking powder, our baking soda, and our salt. Now we'll combine the dry ingredients and we'll cover them and set them aside. Next we'll put our softened butter in our mixer bowl and we'll save the wrapper. We'll grease each of our cake pans with shortening and we'll make sure that every area of each pan is covered with shortening. My mother always told me when you're making a cake you want to make sure that you use plenty of shortening. When you're making pancakes, you use much less. Next, we'll flour each pan. Put some flour in. Shake it around. Then we can move the extra to another pan. And the idea here is, again, to make sure every area is well coated. And we'll do this for all three pans. At this point, we'll cover the cake pans and set them aside while we make the batter. Our butter is nice and soft, so at this point, we'll go ahead and whip the butter until it's light and fluffy. We have to stop the mixer from time to time. We'll be doing this for a little while to clean the beater and make sure that the butter and later the sugar and the eggs are nicely incorporated. Next we'll add our sugar and we'll continue to mix the butter and the sugar to incorporate the sugar. Alright, we've been mixing the butter and sugar together for a few minutes. And next, we'll beat it a little bit longer. We want to make sure that all the butter is coming up from the bottom of the bowl. We'll beat it a little bit longer before we add our eggs and vanilla. Next, we'll crack one egg at a time. And we'll add it to the butter and sugar. And we'll mix that up for a few minutes before we add the other egg. Next, we'll add the vanilla, and we'll continue to mix this together. All right, we've heated our water in the microwave, and we've measured our cocoa. So we'll add the two together, and then we'll mix them up. After we've mixed in the cocoa, we'll set it aside to cool. It has to be cooled at least to room temperature before we add it to our cake batter. Alright, we've been mixing our butter, sugar, eggs, and vanilla. And as you can see, we have a nice, fluffy, partial batter here. This is how it should look. Our cocoa and water have cooled off. And we've measured out our sour cream. And now we'll mix the two of them together. Next, we'll alternate adding our dry ingredients, our flour, and our liquid ingredients into our mix. And we start in about fourths. And we add the dry ingredients first. Then we're going to mix that, stop the mixer, and then we'll add some of the cocoa liquid. Okay, we've added the last of our cocoa, and at this point we always want to end with the dry ingredients. So our last step for a batter at least is to add the rest of the flour and incorporate it. We'll make sure we scrape down the sides of the bowl and turn the mixer for just half a minute to make sure everything is incorporated. Now our cake batter is nice and thick, and this is how it should look. Okay, we're ready to put our batter in our pans, and we can estimate, eyeball it, in dividing it up equally between the pans. Or another thing we can do is to use a cup, measuring cup, and alternate putting the batter in one pan and then another. I guess that's a more precise way of making sure that each pan has the same amount of cake batter. Our cake pans are ready to put in the oven. I want to keep our cake from becoming dry, so I placed a casserole dish with water in the oven on the rack below the rack for the cake pans. And I did that before I preheated the oven. And then in a little bit, we're going to check on our cakes and tent them with aluminum foil. Our cake layers have been baking for 12 minutes. And at this point, I'm going to tent them with foil to make sure they don't dry out. Our layers have been baking for 15 minutes. And at this point, we're going to check for doneness. And they still have a ways to go in the center. Our cake layers have been baking for now 18 minutes, and we're going to test for doneness again. You can see that that one's done because the knife comes out clean. This one needs a little bit more work. We'll place our layer that's not quite ready in the center of the oven, and we'll check it again in 2 minutes. We're checking our third layer, and the knife comes out just about clean. So we're going to give it another 30 seconds, and then we'll take it out of the oven because it will continue to bake somewhat even after we remove it. Alright, we have all of our cake layers out of the oven. Put them on a rack, and we'll cover them with a towel until they cool. To make our frosting, we'll leave our butter out to soften to room temperature. We'll place our shortening in our mixer bowl. We'll add our water and our vanilla and our softened butter, and next we'll mix them together until they're very well blended. Next we'll add our cocoa to our confectioner's sugar and mix it together. Next we'll incorporate our dry ingredients into the butter a little at a time. So we'll measure in about 1 cup, and then we'll slowly begin to mix them together. If it seems that the mixture is too dry, you can add a little bit of water at a time, but be careful because we're using confectioner's sugar. The frosting can become too thin very quickly. And if you have no more confectioner's sugar to add, then you have a problem. Alright, it's time to frost our cake, and we'll begin by placing 2 sheets of wax paper side by side on our cake plate. Next we'll loosen our cake from the pan. We need to dig under there a bit because it might get stuck. Flip it over and place it top down on our cake plate. Next we add our frosting to this layer. And we'll add our second layer after this. When you add the next layer, it's a bit easier if you put it crumb side down. If it looks like the layers are a bit uneven, you can use a knife to gently go around and even them out. All right, we've finished frosting our second layer. Now we'll add our top layer. When we remove these from the pan, we may have to use the spatula to loosen it up a bit from the bottom. If it doesn't come all the way out, we can always remove the crumb from the pan and add that. Now we'll place it this way. Now we'll frost the top of our cake. Okay, now we'll work on the sides of our cake. And what we can do is add some frosting here along the top edge, and then gently work it down and go around the cake with our spatula. And do that around the entire cake. Now that we have the sides frosted, we can go around the top and try to make some pretty swirls. We have a little bit of frosting left over, so we can put that in the freezer and probably stay good for a month in case we need it for some other cake or other purpose. Now that we have our cake frosted, we can remove our wax paper. That's where we had all the crumbs and extra frosting. And we can do this because we put two sheets side by side. Okay, so there you have it, homemade, from scratch, cocoa cake.